Well, welcome everybody to the Kennan Institute's first Facebook Live conversation. This is going to be a quick hit. We've just got half an hour to cover an enormously important and quite enormous topic, but we're very fortunate to have with us two of the world's absolute leading experts in U.S.-Russia relations, experts in the sense of course, having studied and written and researched a tremendous amount about all of the topics related to the U.S.-Russia relationship. But in fact, having steered that policy as senior directors, that is, the senior advisor on the National Security Council staff in the White House for two U.S. presidents. Celeste Wallander served as senior director for President Barack Obama, and Tom Graham served as senior director for President George W. Bush. So two different periods in the U.S.-Russia relationship, two different sets of experience, but absolute expertise. And we're enormously pleased to bring that to you today. To try and keep the conversation flowing, we're going to treat this not as a typical panel where each person is going to open with their thoughts on the central question of how and whether the U.S.-Russia relationship can be managed in our unprecedented times of pandemic, but rather treat this as a conversation as if we were on the sidelines of a conference or event in the real world. And just having a chat. And I think that we'll find that half an hour is a good amount of time for doing that. So it's an experiment. Thanks for taking part with us. Tom and Celeste, I want to open this conversation and throw it to both of you with the following dilemma. On the one hand, it strikes me that this is a relationship between Moscow and Washington, between the Russian people and the American people, which is enormously complex. There's so much water under the bridge at this point. There's so much memory of tit for tat, of mistakes and offenses, and it's enormously politically fraught as well. The prospects, many people would argue, for getting anywhere are not good no matter what at any time. And at this time in particular, there's so much else on our plates. We are, after all, facing an existential crisis for a number of the systems and economies around the world, not to speak of human health and safety and life, that people might argue, in fact, they have argued, now is not the time to attempt to engage Russia, whatever your goals may be, and they may be right to do so. On the other hand, this is a relationship that has implications for those same questions: global systems, the global economy, human health and safety, in particular when it comes to conflict. We have the collapsing nuclear arms control agenda, the impending end of the New START nuclear treaty, the last treaty standing. We have ongoing wars in Ukraine and Syria and Libya. We have the risk of these near-miss incidents between Russian and U.S. forces in various parts of the globe, most recently, of course, in Syria, but often in airspace and at sea. And of course, we have energy issues, which is perhaps the one area where the two presidents have had discussions recently. And we have the pandemic itself, two of the largest countries in the world that face enormous impacts from the pandemic. So with all of that, isn't that a compelling argument to do something, to try to engage productively in a relationship that hasn't been productive for some time? So with that lay of the land, what do you guys think? What is your advice? What do we do? What would you advise an American president to do?
Well, I would not worry about the relationship. And you've laid out a compelling case for getting on with the important work of, from an American point of view, protecting and advancing American interests. And in some issue areas, Russia's the most important partner for that. You named New START. Why is the United States not extending the New START treaty? Russia has now not only removed the conditions for extending New START, which it had held out in 2016 and 2017, but President Putin has offered to talk about new weapon systems, which was something that was off the table. It's a no-brainer. You extend New START, you move on to strategic stability talks, you get the general staff and the joint staff talking like on Zoom or the government equivalent of Zoom, so that we can get to talking about destabilizing military capabilities, concerns that each side has. It doesn't mean you have to agree. Having the joint staff and the general staff experts, the real defense experts, talk to one another about these new weapons capabilities, these new deployments, these new operations, does not mean you necessarily agree on the next arms control treaty, but you get to that after you extend New START. And there's no excuse excuse at this point, in my view, for not extending New START and taking that next step. Because you can do that even in an era of no travel. You can do it via this kind of vehicle. And that's what should happen right now.
Yeah, I would agree with Celeste on that, Matt. I think that's absolutely right. Uh, Diplomacy does become much more complicated in the COVID era because of the lack of face-to-face meetings. You get a lot of real work done on the difficult issues when people can sit down face-to-face. They get to know one another. There's some level of trust between them, and you can walk off into a side room or out in the woods or someplace where you can have a confidential conversation to break through some of the more knottier problems that will arise in any negotiation. This is particularly true of START when we're thinking about strategic stability and what this is going to look like over the next several years. So the easiest thing to do at this point is to agree to the extension. Let's keep it in place for another 5 years, and then begin to have the conversation, realizing that there's a limited amount still important that you can do through Zoom and elsewhere and other channels, and wait for that time when real diplomacy can return. You can sit across the table from one another and discuss some of the more sensitive issues. That works for START. On some of the other issues, I think it becomes more problematic. Ukraine, we haven't been engaged for some time on Ukraine. It's hard to start that, particularly because we don't have an envoy. There's not a face on the Russian that the Russians know already that could have the types of conversation that someone who's been engaged in this for some time could. So I think we need to focus on those that are absolutely priorities for the United States at this point. Some of the other things we're going to have to put on hold until we can conduct diplomacy in a somewhat different fashion.
But
on diplomacy, I agree with Tom that some things have to be face to face. But on Ukraine, you could contribute to small steps, and the Ukrainians and Russians did a pretty good job on some small steps, like some people-to-people steps, release of prisoners, some confidence building, pulling back of forces. Hopefully, they could continue to advance that, and we might be able to support that electronically, diplomatically, and these kinds of talks between governments. I doubt that either the Russian government or the Ukrainian government is going to find itself in a position right now where it can take some politically courageous steps necessary to really begin to address each side's concerns about what's written down in Minsk. But that doesn't mean that some of those really constructive humanitarian and trust building kinds of steps that actually Zelensky and Putin did make some progress on, that could possibly take place over the government version of Zoom. And if the United States and the EU could help advance that, even if we don't have an envoy, that might be another useful step that the State Department could look at.
Yeah, but I think the real question here is how you help in something like this. Is something that really the Kiev and Moscow are focused on right now. They have the contacts. I think the problem for us is engaging in this when we haven't really been actively engaged for a considerable period of time, and who the envoy is, who's the person who holds those discussions, that has a certain level of trust in Moscow, so that they know that they're talking to someone that's authoritative. If you look at this situation, this would be an ideal moment for the two ambassadors to play a large role. They are in the capitals, they have some access. Even with the restrictions of COVID, there's certain things that you could do even face to face. The problem I think we would have is that I don't think anybody in Washington believes that the current Russian ambassador actually speaks authoritatively for the Kremlin, and the same thing is true of the American ambassador in Moscow. I think that's unfortunate, but that would be a channel that you could activate at this point that allows for some face-to-face diplomacy and for some more confidential conversations that you can't have no matter how well-structured your Zoom conversations might be.
So it strikes me you guys are having an eminently reasonable conversation, which may be my fault as moderator, suggesting it would be like one that we might have on the margins of a conference, which would be reasonable. But the reality is, our public discourse and the degree to which our politics is going to play into anything that has to do with Russia or US-Russia relations, and the same argument really might be made on the Russian side, is going to be anything but reasonable. The idea that we could fix on low-hanging fruit relatively low transaction cost achievements like extending New START and maybe sort of piling on to some of the good stuff the Ukrainians and Russians are already willing to do on their own. But look, if that were as easy as it sounds, it would have been done already, right? Not to be glib about it. It seems to me we've got much bigger roadblocks here that are in the realm of psychology and politics and much else. Do you even bother trying to clear those right now when we have the challenge of 22 million Americans out of work? Are we kind of missing the point here as seen by the public?
Well, you're right that there's political constraints, certainly in the United States. There are different kinds of political constraints in Moscow, but let's take the United States first. But what we've also, well, first of all, the constraints on New START extension are entirely self-imposed. It's the negotiating position of the Trump administration that it isn't interested in a bilateral agreement, extending it, that it has to include China. And so that is a self-imposed problem or obstacle. And it can, being self-imposed, it can be self-lifted. But on your larger point about sort of the politics of engaging with Russia, what we've actually seen over the last 3 years is that when it gets down to the working level, it kind of gets out of the headlines, and some decent work can be done that is constructive and that does advance the American national interests. And I take Tom's point that diplomacy is best done face to face. But it's not going to be done face to face right now. And so trying to at least have some kinds of discussions at a working level. Yes, it would be nice to have a special envoy for Ukraine, but under the Barack Obama administration, we didn't have a special envoy for Ukraine. It was the Assistant Secretary of State who led those discussions in supporting implementation of Minsk. So you could assign someone, a line official. There aren't enough in the State Department, but you do have, for example, Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun, who presumably could lead a discussion. Again, it's not perfect, it's not in person. So I think there are ways to advance this over the next 6 months. And come November, we may have a new administration, we may have a continuity of this administration, but this is a time when to at least lay the groundwork for advancing some of these core interests that I agree with Tom really shouldn't, and you, Matt, that we shouldn't be ignoring them even at a time of possible presidential transition in the United States.
Yeah, Matt, I just add to that. I mean, there's a lot that we need to do in the relationship that needs to be done under the radar. If we want to engage on Ukraine in a constructive way, we don't want that to be a public discussion. If you get this into the public realm, then people take shots at it. It's much more difficult to do that. A lot of the things that we have on the agenda with the Russians, whether it be Ukraine, dealing with Afghanistan, there'll be some concerns about North Korea, deconfliction, some other related issues. Those things are best done out of the public limelight, where we can have the types of conversations that we need that get more confidential as people develop trust in one another, and allow us some latitude for, if not resolving them entirely, at least easing them in some ways. So out of public limelight, as Celeste said, with line officials. It doesn't have to be the president. This doesn't have to be the Secretary of State engaged with. In fact, we make much more progress when we get the people who know the issues extremely well, are talking through the difficult matters and reaching some sort of understanding of where each side is and what the possibilities are for moving a particular issue forward.
And if I can just jump in to expand on that, it's not just line officials in the US government or in Russian government, it's people outside of government too. For me, the big takeaway on the failure of the OPEC Plus agreement and the sort of presidential diplomacy is that oil markets are not affected by what the president of the United States says to Vladimir Putin. They're going to be affected on the American side. Now, I take the point on for Saudi Arabia and Russia, this is much more a government-run policy, but it's the private sector in the United States that drives decisions about drilling, about output, about all kinds of investments and timing. And so, and in this, by the same token, you've just to touch on the issue of the pandemic. This would be an opportunity at a time to have American and Russian public health officials and scientists who work in the area of vaccine development, of treatment, of studying viruses, studying global pandemics. They may not solve the problem, but there is an opportunity there for those who have expertise to at least begin to talk with one another. And we've kind of lost that too, with all of our focus during the Trump administration on did the presidents talk and what does that mean? That's not where, you know, bilateral relations really, where the good friction comes. That comes more broadly from businesses, from people to people, from scientist to scientist interactions. And that's something else that we should not look askance at, but actually do what we can to encourage.
Yeah, the one thing here, though, is to remember if we're dealing with the COVID crisis, public health, vaccines, and so forth, that this isn't simply bilateral effort. This is multilateral. And that means including the Russians in those multilateral efforts. The United States should participate. Whether you need something that's technically bilateral or not, I think that is a different question. Probably not, but the Russians ought to be included in the conversation that everybody should have as we try to figure out how best to combat this very serious outbreak.
So talking about multilateralism, I have a good hook to bring in one of our questions coming in via Facebook. Professor Amaryllis Lugo de Fabritz from Howard University asks, how do you see US-Russia relations evolving on policies on broader global issues like Russia's relationship with Venezuela, which of course has a tie-in to global oil markets? It does seem like some of these complex issues that would have been difficult to talk about under normal circumstances are clearly a bridge too far now, both because of the policy issues we're stuck on and because of the points you made, well, both of you made about, you know, what you can kind of do in this format and what needs to be face to face. Or do you think we can deal with crises and hotspots like Venezuela, and we've barely touched on Syria as well?
Well, Matt, you have to deal with crises as they arise. And so you figure out a way to do it, even under the conditions that we're operating under now. If you look at Venezuela, the Russians know who our envoy is. They have had some conversations. We're not approaching Venezuela as sort of a blank spot in the relationship. So you can build on that. Obviously, it's doing it through Zoom or other types of channels is not the most positive, but I think we can have a conversation on that. I think my guess is that Venezuela did come up in some of the discussions over oil price and how we're going to manage oil prices going forward and what the implications would be for Venezuela and how we're going to deal with that. So I think as crises arise, we will find the methods that we need to communicate to try to at least diffuse them, as opposed to letting them spin out of control.
I think that's right. And on Syria, coming back to Tom's very good point, which is we always have to understand that sometimes the best framework for managing a crisis or talking to Russia is a multilateral one. And however the horror in Syria plays out, at some point there is going to have to be reconstruction. At some point there is going to have to be addressing the humanitarian terror and horror that exists in the country and outside the country. And that's going to involve not just Russia talking to the United States, but it's going to very much involve the Middle East as actors in the Middle East as players, as neighbors, as sources of resources and expertise, and of course Europe. So I'm not aware of how active UN structures are right now, and whether there's a UN. I'm sure there is communication, and the UN has a role to play. But whereas the multilateral realm, at least my experience during the Obama administration, was often a source of friction for the United States and Russia. We were often clashing about what international law looks like, what obligations look like, what the role of the Security Council would be. It's worth taking a step back and seeing whether multilateral structures couldn't ease the bilateral relationship by making our cooperation or our efforts in these crises to be more constructive, because they involve other countries as well.
Yeah, but as a general rule, the larger the multilateral group becomes, the more difficult it is to manage the relationship. So if you're focused on the Middle East, obviously I think Celeste is right. This isn't an issue that the United States and Russia can resolve on their own. They're the regional powers. There's some extra-regional powers as well. But if you can keep the group fairly small, then in a multilateral context, I think it's much easier to deal with the Russians. The Russians, for example, when we think about North Korea, the Russians from time to time have actually been constructive in talks on North Korea. That is a fairly small multilateral forum with the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the North Koreans. That actually works. If you expanded this to a discussion at the UN Security Council, or within the UN, it becomes much more difficult because of the number of actors you have involved. So keep the multilateral aspect to it, but keep the multilateral limited to a group that's workable, that's focused on the issues that need to be addressed in order to resolve the larger issue that you're dealing with at any moment.
So speaking of focused and workable groups, I have a question about Congress from a veteran of Capitol Hill, Dr. Jason Bruder. He asks about the role that Congress is playing in U.S.-Russia relations now, and what role is it likely to play if you think about the election and what may happen during and after. Presumably, he's also thinking here about Russian interference of some kind.
Well, Congress has played, in my view, an important role in the checks and balances of U.S. government as relates to Russian foreign policy. You know, there's skepticism of some of the initiatives that the Trump administration seemed to, or at least the White House seemed to want to advance. And it's useful for Congress to play an oversight role and making sure that the main elements of U.S. Engagement with or strategy on Russia serve the national interest. Where it becomes more difficult is where it becomes a little bit toxic politically to do the things that actually are in the American national interest, like New START extension, like possibly sharing information where possible on terrorist threats. So finding, it would be, I think one of the problems right now is that because we have such a partisan Congress, that even on those issues which historically you used to be able to expect some kind of constructive back and forth within the Congress and then between the Congress and the executive branch, that's gotten frayed. Whether that gets better if there is a second Trump term, I doubt. Whether that gets better if there is a new presidential administration come 2021, it's going to be part of the work that needs to be done by whoever is in the executive and in the congressional leadership starting next year. Yeah.
Celeste is absolutely right. I mean, Congress has an important oversight role to play. And they ought to be conducting hearings when they can to discuss U.S.-Russian relations and make sure we have an understanding of what our national interests are, what the way forward is, how the United States will be positioning itself at any given moment. Where Congress, I think, becomes problematic is when they get into the sanctions business of actually mandating sanctions, which deprives the executive branch of the flexibility that it needs in order to conduct a serious diplomatic effort with the Russians. That I think is not going to change anytime soon. The real issue is whether Congress will decide that it needs to levy additional sanctions on Russia or keep levying sanctions on Russia in a way that makes it much more difficult to solve some of the issues that are on the agenda at this point. I would make a point about the elections. It seems to me that much will depend on the margin of victory, whoever wins in November. We're always worried about Russian interference. We need to, it is a real issue. We need to take it seriously. We need to focus on it. I think some of the discussion in the United States has become counterproductive. We begin to see Russians behind every bit of problem that we have in this country. That, I think, undermines our own effort to deal with them effectively. But if we have a sufficient margin of victory by either the Democratic candidate or Trump, the issue of Russian interference will become, I think, less of a matter in the American domestic politics, which will allow us to have a more balanced conversation. What is a very difficult problem of how we manage relations with Russia so as we can advance American national interests.
We're in the home stretch with just 5 minutes left, and even though I have a number of other questions here, I'm going to selfishly bring in the topic that has just been preoccupying me when I'm not thinking about how to homeschool my kids and keep the house from falling down. And that is, isn't the world order as we have known it, and as we have speculated for decades, those who read the end of history debates in the 90s, isn't it changing before our eyes? And doesn't that change promise some kind of fundamental change in the major power relationships? I would say maybe first on the list, US-China, but I think US-Russia has got to be very high on that list. What, in your view, does that look like? Are we likely to have more continuity than not coming out of this pandemic, or is it really going to be a fundamentally changed world where US-Russia relations are concerned? And does that kind of make so much that we've discussed moot?
So I think you're right. And first and foremost, it's what will be the global economic consequences, and how will that restructure power relations and the rules of the game, because power relations are based on rules of the game are based on power relations. I don't see anything from what I've been following in predictions about the fall in global GDP growth, and in particular Russia's economic shrinking, which is going to happen this year, and then it may turn around next year. I don't see anything that really helps the Russian leadership get out of the kind of hole it's already dug itself in over-reliance on natural resources, and creating, not investing in a positive business environment at home to encourage innovation, entrepreneurship, foreign investment, even Russian investment in, sort of a new economy. So I hope I'm wrong. I'm hoping maybe the shock of this economic of these difficulties will force a rethink on that. But if that's the case, I think the real variables are, how does the United States come out of this? How does Europe come out of this? And how does China come out of this? Because at this point, Russia's still in those upper ranks, but it was already facing kind of a declining capability relative to certainly China, and it wasn't catching up with the United States. So it could well really lead to a fundamental reordering of power relations.
Yeah, I think I would argue that, a lot of what you're talking about, Matt, was in play before this crisis with the COVID virus erupted. The COVID crisis might act as a catalyst, accelerating some of these developments, but it's not going to fundamentally change what the nature of the problem is. China will still be a player. Europe will be a player of some sort. How unified it will be is a question. The United States will be a player. And almost any scenario, Russia is going to be a player as well. Celeste is absolutely right. The relative balance may shift a little bit because of the crisis, the extent of the economic decline in all those countries. But the fundamental problem we face of how you put together a world order that is built on the consensus of the leading powers is going to remain. And that is not going to get any easier, no matter what happens over the next several months with the pandemic.
Well, I guess what I'd like to close with is to ask each of you if you could make a single recommendation for the United States government in shaping U.S. policy towards Russia coming out of the pandemic. Your 20 seconds in an elevator through a mask with the president, what would it be?
I'd use my 20 seconds where I started, which is, you will create a foundation of trust and stability in the core where there is the most distrust and instability if you extend New START and get going on serious defense-to-defense discussions about the weapon systems and the capabilities that each side is really worried about.
Short answer is I agree with Celeste on that, but we need to figure out how to restore normal functioning diplomatic relations. Doesn't mean we're going to agree, doesn't mean business as usual, but we need to talk to one another to find out what we think, where the red lines are, what the dangers are if we want to protect American national interests going forward.
Well, and fortunately for all of us, if the president's wearing a mask, we won't be able to tell if he's smiling or frowning or even firing you as a result of having said that. So it's all good advice. Thank you both so much for participating in this experimental Petri dish conversation on Facebook Live. And thank you everybody for tuning in and submitting your questions. Signing off. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.